Welcome back to Mental Health, where we tackle pop culture, social issues, and politics through a mental health lens. Today I wanted to talk about a topic that is near and dear to me. I am a huge David Lynch fan, not only Twin Peaks, but also his films. And as I was rewatching the new season of Twin Peaks, which, by the way, is fantastic, and fair warning, as we get into this, I'm going to be giving a lot of potential spoilers for not only Twin Peaks, but also Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, etc. So if you haven't seen those yet and you're planning on it, please watch them. They're fantastic, and I don't want to spoil them for you. But in any case, as I was rewatching the new season, I just kept thinking about how trauma is such a foundational element behind pretty much all of Lynch's works. The man seems to be obsessed with not only trauma reactions, but specifically dissociation that can spawn from that. And he tackles this both in the victims and the aggressors of these horrible, horrible, tragic events. So just diving into it, the first film I saw from David Lynch was Mulholland Drive, and it started me down this whole road into kind of more artsy, abstract filmmaking. That movie, as well as Lost Highway, are both prime examples of how dissociation can occur in the fallout of a horrible event. And in fact, in a rare case of David Lynch actually explaining himself because he loathes to do so, he was in an interview where he said that the concept for Lost Highway actually came to him from watching the O.J. Simpson trial. And basically his thinking is, if this man is guilty, what is the mindset of a person like that? What's the mindset of somebody who has committed this horrible, horrible act and has to somehow continue to function in day-to-day society and appear normal? And so both of these movies kind of in slightly different ways toy with that idea, that inner working of the mind in a person who has committed some terrible atrocity. So, spoiler in both cases of these films, at least from my interpretation and going along with many other interpretations I've read, the main characters have both killed their significant others. In Mulholland Drive, she's murdered her former lover after seemingly becoming jealous of her dating this new man. And in Lost Highway, he has murdered his wife also over jealousy and thinking that she's cheating on him. Seems to be the subtext there. And so the entire movie is really this internalized process of them having so much cognitive dissonance because of this, that they can't come to the terms with the fact that they've committed this horrible thing, that they create this new narrative in their mind. And that's really what we're watching on the screen, is this restoring of what actually happened. And so rather than deal with the pain and the guilt of what they've done, they've created a new narrative where they're the hero and they're the savior. And so in Mulholland Drive, she saves this poor woman from this car crash and she has amnesia, and it's very dramatic. And that's why these movies are acted in such a strange, dreamy, unnatural fashion, is because it's not reality. It's more like when you have a dream, or in this case, this kind of daydream dissociation that they're experiencing. And she's the great actress, and she's helping to save this woman and make her whole again. And then in Lost Highway, when he is taken to jail for killing his wife, he literally becomes a new person. They switch actors, and everyone's confused, and they have to just let him go. And once more, he encounters this woman that looks just like his wife, and he's going to save her from this horrible mobster and rescue her from this lifestyle of prostitution that she's in. So again, both characters trying to, in their own way, come to terms with what they've done by just completely manipulating the story in their head. And you see people do this. It's really quite sad. And then as those movies go on, you see that reality start to collapse because they can't maintain it. There's just too much there, and eventually reality starts seeping through. And that's where, in both cases, things start to get kind of crazy on screen. Things don't make sense. Fantasies blending with reality, and eventually it can't sustain itself as a system anymore. So both of those films, really great interpretations of probably a lot of what it's like to be in that kind of situation. But those are the smaller examples, really. What I really want to talk about is Twin Peaks, because the lore of Twin Peaks and really the entire world is quite literally built on trauma. So many themes of this series run straight to the core of its narratives. So much so that there's no getting around it, basically, in any sort of discussion or interpretation that you can make of it. And of course, the most obvious case is Laura Palmer. Of all of David Lynch's characters, nobody truly embodies trauma quite like Laura Palmer.
Faster and faster. And for a long time, you wouldn't feel anything. And then you'd burst into fire. Forever.
Here we have a young woman who has for many years suffered sexual and physical abuse at the hands of this paranormal villain, Bob. And Bob and the beings of the lodge serve as an excellent metaphor and stand-in, really, for the impact of trauma. And really, one could argue, and I've seen people do this, that Bob doesn't really exist at all, and is really just Laura's rationalization to avoid facing the fact that her true aggressor was her own father. This is something that I've seen in my own trauma work, where people cannot come to terms with the fact that it was a family member, and again craft this completely different story, sometimes fantastical in nature, in their head. And that becomes their reality. People can believe something so hard that it becomes real to them. But in any case, these Black Lodge beings quite literally feed on the pain and suffering of human beings, which always makes me reflect on the negative energy that seems to follow trauma victims around. It really is like a dark cloud, like siphoning their energy all the time. I've spent a lot of time around these trauma survivors, and you can almost feel it in their mood and also how they present themselves. And so many times I've also heard and seen in my own clinical experience that this electricity, if we can call it that, seems to create a sort of magnetism towards other abusers. And it leads to this unending cycle where they've been abused and then they return to the hands of more abusers and they're abused again. It's like the predators, these real life Bobs, can sense or even literally smell the garmonbosia on them. But returning to the character of Laura herself, few have so fully, again, embodied the complex and tragic results of chronic abuse. Laura's the type of survivor I sadly encounter frequently at my work. And these are the ones who get labeled as behavior problems, troubled kids, bad seeds. Because while Laura has become really great at maintaining the mask of this ideal grade A student around the adults in her life, she's really anything but an angel. She smokes and does cocaine. She engages in questionable sexual behaviors with older and unsavory men, sometimes in exchange for money, even working out of the nearby brothel. And she manipulates men in her life like Bobby and James to feed those addictions and just in general get what she wants. And these are all behaviors that I've heard those who have watched Fire Walk with me describe Laura as a monster. And really, like, why do we feel sorry for her? She's an awful person. I've seen people say that. And sadly, so is the case with the kids I've worked with over the years, where adults look at the behaviors and conclude that this person is a problem. They're a problem child. But really what we're looking at, just another ugly byproduct of the trauma. It's not all nightmares and flashbacks hindering a meek and sorrowful young person when it comes to trauma. Sometimes it looks like that, but quite to the contrary, many respond to trauma in these more troublesome ways, especially in youth. And it all comes from this need to regain control. If you're thinking of the kid as like a tree, okay, and the branches are representative of the behaviors, and those branches grow depending on how you feed this tree. And you can try to hack off branches, you can try to trim the tree, but what happens when you cut off branches on a tree? They eventually grow back, right? Trauma is like the root of this tree. And until we pull up the root of that trauma, we're not going to be able to plant a new tree, a healthier tree that's going to be able to function. So I think people spend too much time focusing on branches when they need to be looking at the root of all of Laura's behaviors are this trauma and therefore this need for control. So those who have experienced or are still experiencing trauma were often robbed of this sense of security and control. And that's really just a basic need for living a functional life. If you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like you have some ability to manage a situation, then it's hard to really get past that and get anything done and be productive. So as such, victims like Laura will really do anything in their power to reclaim that sense of control. Laura does drugs because it allows her to escape the pain of her existence and feel pleasure again. She manipulates her significant others to reaffirm her self-worth and status over men because of the man who attacked her and made her feel powerless. She engages in prostitution as a means to reenact her rape from a position of power. And this last one in particular may seem really far-fetched, and I've had people look at me sideways and even get a little bit offended when I say that. But I can't count how many young women in my field I've either worked with or indirectly worked with or heard about that do the exact same thing. We've even worked with cases going so far as the kid will run away from home or run away from treatment to re-engage in a lifestyle of homelessness and prostitution because it's all they know. And it's there, again, they feel out of control at this point being in a stable environment because they're stuck kind of dealing with the anxiety and the emotions. Whereas when they're out there in the chaos, counterintuitively, they feel like they have a greater sense of control in that situation and also a better ability to avoid the true underlying roots, again, as it were. I mean, you'd think that the last thing a rape or sexual assault victim would want to do is have sexual contact, especially with another man or older man or anyone who is like the person that attacked them after what they've been through. But sometimes this really is the case. There's an entire world out there of scorned women seeking to restory their trauma, recasting themselves as the powerful seductress. You see this with porn actresses sometimes as well. And I've even heard of people that engage in things like rape fantasies as a means to, again, kind of reenact and restory and come to terms with, in some cases. Now, it can go either way, depending on how they structure it. I mean, I've heard for some people it's been helpful. And then, of course, there are plenty of situations like Laura's situation where it's very much creating new problems. It's putting her at risk to be re-victimized in a number of ways and harm her health in general. Now, Laura's character, especially as shown in Fire Walk With Me, is perhaps the most raw and therefore realistic depictions of day-to-day life in a survivor's shoes that I can think of. She's like a textbook case of post-traumatic stress disorder without any of the Hollywood glitz or glamour to pretty it up. Because plenty of movies tackle these things, and I've even done a previous episode about Good Will Hunting that I really love, but that movie and plenty of others still, with the music and with the visuals and all this stuff, they kind of sugarcoat it in a way. And Fire Walk with Me absolutely does not do that. And I think that's why a lot of people did not and still do not like this movie, because it is unapologetic and in your face. But yeah, all the criteria are there. Re-experiencing, avoidance, reactivity, and negative cognitions and mood. She does suffer what could be called nightmares in the Red Room and otherwise of her attacker. She responds to those reminders all around her that trigger these really intense reactions of terror. Obviously, this comes to an absolute apex in Season 3's finale, when Cooper/Richard takes her to face her old household in her mysterious Carrie Page form, which I consider to just be kind of another dissociative state. Here is Sarah Palmer completely detached, believing she is a different person, and now having to, this is basically what I do at trauma narratives, having to face what actually happened to them, the full reality and scope of what happened to them, but with a supportive person and ideally in a safe situation so that they are able to sort of reintegrate that. Obviously, there's some ambiguity to that finale in terms of what the outcome of that was, and I could go on all day about all sorts of interpretations that are anywhere from paranormal and existential to philosophical, but ultimately I want to just focus on kind of the trauma points here. Laura also constantly avoids her problems, again opting for more self-destructive measures like casual sex and drugs to distract herself from them. These behaviors sometimes even degrade into outright violence, where she becomes herself abusive towards other people, both verbally and physically. And despite her tough exterior, which is again really just a facade to sort of regain a sense of control, Laura thinks very little of herself, and we see this in how she frequently cautions her friends not to be like her, and she pushes loved ones away to protect them, as we see with James in that famous motorcycle sequence.
Laura! Don't! Come on! Don't! Just don't! I love you, James!
There are aspects of her presentation that would also fit into interpretations of a borderline personality disorder, with that push-pull, I love you, I hate you. Again, literally in that scene, we see that full range. But personally, I always see borderline as just another label and specific arrangement of symptoms relating to this past interrelational trauma. The person has experienced such poor examples and models of relationships and has learned such maladaptive strategies in getting through life that they create this cluster of symptomology that we know as borderline personality disorder. But I like to look at it, and if I had a nickel for every time I worked with somebody who had been labeled as borderline and looked in their history and found significant trauma, I would be a very rich person. She also suffers from obvious intense mood swings and really shifting on a dime from fiery rage to anxiety to sorrow. And of course, there's that blood-curdling scream. If ever there was a sound that could summarize the horrors of trauma, it would be the screams of Laura Palmer. And the story continues. Violence and trauma is often described as cyclical, and this seems to be precisely the idea, especially behind seasons 1 and seasons 3 of Twin Peaks. Because even in her death, her pain and garmonbosia echoes on in her loved ones and in the community. We see Leland Palmer struggling to maintain his usual affable persona. He likes to be seen as this good, friendly, funny guy that does really well in all sorts of social situations, and it fits into his own kind of dissociation. But we frequently see that crumble down, and he collapses into tears and even outright horror, much like the characters in Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway. And then, of course, Sarah Palmer, in the wake of both of the death of her daughter and then later her husband, has become a complete shell of her former self by the time we see her in season 3. She's an empty husk, just waiting to be filled by the literal embodiment of hatred and vitriol. So we have this character of it's sometimes labeled the experiment, sometimes the mother of all evil, sometimes Judy. We don't talk about Judy. But she's literally been possessed and inhabited by this creature. And I think, man, what an amazing and tragic, once again, analogy for what it's like to deal with true grief and trauma and be left in this state where you're completely overcome, and your own bitterness really allows this sort of dark spirit to incubate and hatch into the terror that mental illness can unleash.
Something happened to me. Something happened to me. Thank you. I don't feel good. I don't feel good. Sarah, stop doing this.
We also see echoes of all of this in the domestic violence between Shelley and Leo, and then subsequently her very Laura Palmer-esque daughter Becky and her husband Stephen in the final season. And then also between Norma and her jailbird ex-husband. The entire town has really just been overtaken by this horrible event, where even the seemingly ineffable Agent Cooper, who we think of as this happy-go-lucky, nothing can really faze me guy, is still also haunted by the murder of his former lover at the hands of Wyndham Earle. And this ultimately is what leads to him becoming trapped within his own guilt and sorrow in the Black Lodge. He faced that with incomplete courage, as Hawk puts it, and is now facing his own journey of dissociation, where he very literally has one foot in the lodge and one foot still in the real world, and is split between his good and evil personas. In fact, Cooper's journey reminds me of a saying that I give to caregivers and kids and especially other counselors all the time, and that it's, you can't truly help someone else until you help yourself. We often use this airplane oxygen mask metaphor where they tell you in the safety instructions that if you're a caregiver and you have a child with you on the plane and the oxygen mask dropped down, you need to put your oxygen mask on before you put theirs on. Otherwise, you may, both pass out and, now you're no good to anybody. And so Cooper, I think, is very much in that space. He's one of those people that just gives all of himself to everyone else all the time. And he's constantly got that need to be the savior. I've even heard him kind of described as this white knight. And that can be a problem, because if you're doing that for the wrong reasons, if you're doing that just to kind of ignore your own issues, then eventually you're going to become compromised. There's, that we talk about things like burnout, where people have given so much of themselves that they literally have nothing left to give. And we see that when Cooper goes into the lodge. And so now I feel like his main task throughout season 3, regardless of how you specifically interpret in what manner it's happening, Cooper has to work through his own stuff, or to quote Dr. Jacoby / Dr. Amp, he needs to shovel himself out of his own shit. And that all needs to happen before he can do anything to truly help Laura or the town of Twin Peaks. And so we see that journey with him as Dougie, where again, there's so much evidence that he really does truly have half of himself in the real world and half of himself is still in the lodge. We see lodge imagery like the pale horse or the silver Mustang in the casino, and people wearing lodge colors and lodge designs and other just mirroring of lodge elements, just to show that he's on kind of this metaphysical, existential spirit journey to reintegrate himself. And that fits really well too, because Hawk says in the earlier seasons that if you face the Black Lodge and you're not prepared for it, then you will be utterly like fractured and annihilated. And so he's having to bring all of the pieces of himself back together. And so he's relearning kind of the value of family and just simple day-to-day understanding the love of just having a child and having a wife that cares even when things get difficult, and literally kind of doing this battle with his shadow self of Mr. C and all of his henchmen, and kind of accepting his own faults too, accepting things that he's done wrong and things that are not perfect about himself, despite his own facade that he puts on that is this, Dale Cooper. The Dale Cooper that we think about is very much like an idealized version of what a great man looks like. And it's just not realistic. And I think Lynch is repeatedly pointing that out, that the Dale Cooper we love can't truly exist in reality. We can aspire to be like aspects of that, but there's so much more to a human being that we have to recognize. And this even especially comes to a head, I think. I mean, he works through that journey. He becomes Dale again. He recognizes kind of the, we live within a dream, which within the context of trauma could be seen as, there's more to reality than just our own perception. And so he recognizes that he still has work to do. There's still things that he needs to do for himself. Thus, this journey he has to take with Diane. And man, what another scene that I could probably do a whole podcast on, unpacking him and Diane going to the motel, and very much again kind of like Lost Highway. She sees a double of herself, which again seems to be sort of representing her own dissociation, because Diane has also been through sexual trauma. She was raped by Mr. C, and now part of their mission seems to be that she has to have sex with Cooper, who she really cares about, but literally looks exactly like the person who raped her. So in knowing that that's about to happen, she is going into this state where she's kind of having to separate herself from herself, which is a very common thing for sexual assault survivors to do. And they go into the hotel room, and there's this loveless, ominous sex scene between them where there's nothing really pleasant about it. It's very uncomfortable to watch, and it's very much kind of out of duty. And it makes me go back again to what I was saying about people kind of reenacting their rapes and engaging in sort of rape fantasy. It may not be pleasant, but it seems like this is almost like part of her kind of therapy to get past what happened to her. She has to re-engage in this awful experience and re-experience this horrible thing that happened to her with more or less the same body that did it to her. And that's why she's covering his face and looking up at the ceiling and not wanting to fully engage with it, but just try to bring that to some closure.
When the twilight is gone and no songbirds are singing, when the twilight is gone, you come into my heart.
And right after that, that's where we see Cooper become Richard. And Richard, basically, I look at as kind of more of a realistic version of what Cooper would be like in our world. He wouldn't be this, always got a smile, always ready for a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie. He's got his good qualities where he's trying to help, he's trying to complete his mission, and he makes his mistakes too. He's out in the world, fighting off these two bad guys, but, discharging his weapon in the middle of a restaurant and actually pointing the gun at other innocent people in the restaurant, and being irresponsible, putting the gun in the deep fryer, which could be dangerous, and even tells people to step away. And it's like, he doesn't want to hurt other people, but even people with good intentions in the real world make bad decisions. again, I could go much more into my more in-depth sort of plot-based paranormal and philosophical interpretation of what's all happening in that final episode, but it's still kind of an interesting way of looking at Cooper's journey through his own trauma and reintegrating himself. And we don't even have enough time to talk about Audrey. Audrey is another character that I could spend another whole episode talking about, but she also is clearly engaging in her own crisis of identity. She literally says, have you ever felt like you're not yourself? I feel like I am myself, but I'm not myself. I want to go to the roadhouse, but I also want to stay. And Charlie says to her, this is existentialism 101. She's dealing with her own dissociation, seemingly either because she's in a coma or she's still dealing with the after effects of having been in that violent event where the bank blew up in season 2. And her reality is crumbling very much like thematically, again, we've seen in Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway and for plenty of other Lynch characters. Reality and her kind of made up fantasy world are colliding, and it's coming to her head where she's having to accept this awful thing that's happened to her, and we never know if she fully is able to do that, but it does seem like she sort of snaps into potentially what's reality and is having a really hard time coming to terms with that. So I could go on and on and on with example after example, but suffice it to say that season 3 in particular plays out like this trauma has become a sickening plague on the town, altering perceptions and gaining momentum with every new victim it takes, to the point where it's literally destabilizing time and space. And we have these very strange interactions and dreamlike parts, and people are ODing on drugs, and we have that strange scene with the kind of zombie girl in the car vomiting everywhere. And so I feel like these are all just sort of visual interpretations of the same theme. When you're dealing with trauma, reality can become very confusing because your perception of reality has become clouded and filtered through these horrible experiences that you've had. You start to develop overarching themes in your mind of the world's not a safe place, and I'm a terrible person, and people are out to get me, and you can't trust anyone. And when you see the world through that lens, everything starts to become distorted. And when I'm out on the street, I may see somebody passing by and think nothing of it, where this person is in absolute terror that they're going to be attacked. Or a family member is offering them some sort of love and affection, but they're seeing it as some form of manipulation and just a means to hurt them again, either physically or emotionally. So Lynch is just kind of taking that idea and blowing it up into complete hyperbole. And as viewers, when we're seeing this, because it's so novel and strange, we in effect are kind of experiencing that same feeling of confusion and non-reality, and what do I even do with this? How do I push forward with what I'm seeing? And again, I think that's potentially an experience that trauma survivors could relate to. It's only the stabilizing love between characters like Norma and Ed that serve as a reprieve from this utter confusion and chaos. If there's only one moment in the entire season where it feels like things are right and they're in the place that they need to be and all feels good with the world, it's that kiss between Ed and Norma that we've been waiting for so long. But beyond that, it's a really challenging watch, and one that often leaves me just as frustrated as fascinated, and I keep coming back to it. But this discomfort is precisely the point. There really is no sugarcoating or fully understanding the true ramifications of such utterly contemptible violations of a person. I'm especially thinking about the scene where Richard assaults his own grandmother, and how that scene also plays out in a very strange fashion for the big screen. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, and it's really lacking in any of the usual glamorous stylistic comforts of a film or TV show. There's no glorification. It's in fact amplified to the point where you're forced to feel uncomfortable. You've got that repetitive doll on the table just saying, "Hello, Johnny, how are you today?" over and over again, juxtaposed with this poor developmentally disabled adult tied to this chair struggling to help his mother, and she's on the floor crying, not able to help him or herself, and just being screamed at and berated and assaulted and called awful names. And it drags on for far too long, far longer than anyone else would film a scene like that. And it's just perfection, really. I remember the first time I watched it, I was just affixed to the screen and I could not look away. And I couldn't stop thinking about just how awful it was, how just, again, unapologetically awful it was. And I just was like, there's something beautiful about that. There's something so beautiful about David Lynch's willingness to do that and just show that. Because, you know, it's not, there's nothing pretty about it. There's nothing nice about it. There's nothing, you know, you can get artistic about it. There's plenty of filmmakers who have depicted these things on screen in a very kind of strangely satisfying visual way. But Lynch said, no, I'm just going to lay it all out on the screen. I'm going to do everything I can to make it as true to reality as possible. And I'm going to challenge the watcher to really take it in without any of that glorification, and hopefully help them gain some extra level of understanding of what this is really like in reality. And I think that's better than any public service announcement on, you know, not watching violent movies or playing too many violent video games and shaming people. Instead of shaming people, Lynch says, no, I'm just going to present an opportunity for you to see it for yourself, and you can make your own decision about it. So, anyways, this has gone on for far too long, but I honestly could talk about Twin Peaks and David Lynch and just Laura Palmer in general for probably hours and hours, but I'll leave it at that. And hopefully you enjoyed this, whether you're a Lynch or Twin Peaks fan. I think there's something that can really be taken away from these works of art. There's a reason why it's such respected material. I haven't found too many people in the field that are big fans, and I kind of wish more people would look at this, because again, I think it gives a nice extra window. I think it's probably the closest that Hollywood has ever come to really showing the absolute horror of what it's like. But that's it for this time. Please do subscribe if you have not yet already. Check out our previous episodes if you haven't. And until next time, I'll leave you with the words of our wise sages Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan in saying, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.